The rocks are hot as Atari Archive delves into the history of Demons to Diamonds and Math Grand Prix. Atari had committed themselves to releasing new games every month of 1982, and even though they haven't quite hit that mark, we've seen some real heavy hitters so far. The wide release of Super Breakout in January, the adventuresque Haunted House in February, the surprisingly marketable Yar's Revenge in May, and arcade conversions in Pac-Man and Defender in March and June, respectively. Perhaps recognizing that they missed April, here in July we get two new games really aimed at younger audiences than some of those other titles. Nick Turner's Demons to Diamonds and Suki Lee's Math Grand Prix. Of the two, Demons to Diamonds is the more interesting, if only for how strange it is. This is effectively a shooter playable by a single person, but made significantly more appealing with a partner. With players situated at the top and the bottom of the screen, they are tasked with shooting the demons that spawn in the central region and move slowly along a horizontal lane. Shoot a demon that shares your cannon's color, and they'll spawn a diamond that you can shoot for bonus points. Shoot a demon of the opposing color, and it turns into an indestructible skull that fires shots back at you until it finally disappears on its own. As you get further in, the skulls go from being stationary to moving around the map in their own right, reducing the number of safe areas. Skulls will also periodically spawn on their own, meaning you can't just rely on careful shooting to stay in the game. The demons themselves change color and lane when they reach the edge of the screen, another aspect that players must be especially aware of when they're trying to shoot them in those areas. Point values change depending on how close to the player a demon or a diamond is located, with more points being awarded the further they are from you. Functionally, Demons to Diamonds is a take on old carnival or electromechanical shooting gallery games, albeit one where the targets can and will hit back. This is reflected in the game manual, in which you and a friend are visiting the Cosmic Carnival and are drawn to a target shooting booth hosted by a demon. Demons to Diamonds is also the rare shooter on the VCS that uses the paddle controllers, which allows you to fine-tune your targeting in a way that works effectively with your laser-beamed style shots. You shouldn't assume that this makes the game a cakewalk, as your cannon is pretty chunky and it's tricky to avoid getting shot by the skulls, particularly if they spawn closer to the vertical edges. While author Nick Turner has done very few interviews, he did speak with Ferg of the 2600 Game by Game podcast some years ago, and Ferg generously provided his notes from their conversation. According to their discussion, Demons to Diamonds was not necessarily something Turner had come up with, but rather came out of a high-level focus group at Atari. Turner chose to work on the project as he felt like it had a lot of potential for bells and whistles. Assisting him was Alan Murphy, hired alongside Marilyn Churchill as the company's first two dedicated graphic artists. In this game, Murphy worked on the sprites used. Turner said he had added quite a few special features to the game during development, as the theme and cartridge space had yet to be defined. Turner wanted to have multiple types of targets and rewards, differing sound effects, something that he included with Super Breakout, and super targets that came out at different times, and some that had different movement patterns. These ideas were ultimately cut due to cartridge space, and Turner said the decision to do so was not his and that the game would have likely benefited from having more fun goodies in it. As it stands, Demons to Diamonds doesn't have a large lineup of game variations, only 6 in total. There's the standard default game, an easier variant for smaller kids where the skulls fire slowly and less often, and 2-player versions of both, which in turn provide the choice of whether or not to allow the players to shoot each other. The difficulty switches adjust how rapidly the bullets fired by the skulls move toward the respective player. With this in mind, Turner's desire for more game variations is a bit more obvious. Demons to Diamonds is a pretty straightforward package, and while it's not bad, there isn't much there for a single-player experience. The game is significantly more interesting with a second player. You can accidentally cause a skull to spawn somewhere inconvenient for your opponent if you so choose, or alternately just hang back and steal points by zapping the diamonds that spawn after they take out a demon. And unlike a lot of other 2-player games on the VCS we've seen so far, if one player runs out of lives, that ends the game, but their opponent will get bonus points per remaining life. Exactly how many depends on how many waves into the game you've managed to get, starting with 10 points per life in the first wave, and maxing out at 2,000 points by wave 16. The game modes that allow friendly fire can make this a strategic factor. If a player is falling behind or has a narrow lead, they may try and purposefully shoot their opponent to put them in a better position of coming out ahead in points. This results in a game that, while not an incredible experience, is both fairly unique on the VCS as well as for shooters in general, and pretty fun in its own right. The Demons to Diamonds namesake on the package describes the core game loop well enough, but the cartridge came incredibly close to shipping under a different name, Hot Rocks. By all indications, the name must have been changed shortly before the game's packaging needed to be printed, with advertising featuring the Hot Rocks name appearing in June. The Hot Rocks name even appears in parentheticals in an August newspaper ad for Demons to Diamonds, underlying just how late this change must have come. As Hot Rocks was initially reported on as Atari's April release for the planned Game a Month approach, it begs the question on whether or not this name change was a factor in it being delayed to July. Turner had no insight into the timing of its release, but told Ferg that the name was changed as some folks felt that the name Hot Rocks had some sexual overtones that weren't appropriate for a game targeting kids. Depending on who those people were, that may have been enough to cause a delay. Neither of our games this video were heavily reviewed, but Demons to Diamonds got more press than its counterpart, though I wouldn't say the additional press indicates it was well received. Video Game Update gave it 2 stars for gameplay and graphics, writing that as a single-player experience it was disappointing, but one that offers more challenge with 2 players, but also probably not one that appeals to people over the age of 10. Electronic Fun with Computers and Games wrote that it isn't terribly earth-shattering, with unimpressive graphics and sound, but that the reviewer also kept returning to it, and recommended it to people who enjoyed shooting games. This sentiment was shared by the reviewers in Logical Gamer, with them giving it a qualified yes to fans of the genre, while noting that it really is only challenging with 2 players and friendly fire on. One of them added that both his wife and 4-year-old enjoyed the game as well. Videogaming Illustrated gave it a surprisingly positive in-depth preview, considering it charming and delightful. On the other hand, Joystik remarked that it was fast-paced but repetitive, and Videogames simply referred to this game as dumb, and that the giant of the industry, Atari, had produced a dwarf. And anecdotally, this was one of the games I remember playing a fair bit and enjoying as a 4- and 5-year-old, which suggests to me that it really was a good fit for small children, if not necessarily full-sized adults. Demons to Diamonds does not appear in the portions of Atari's internal sales memo that have appeared online, suggesting it wasn't one of Atari's top-selling titles. For the 1986 to 1990 period we do have numbers for, it seemed to pretty much peter out after 1987, with only 7,990 copies going out in that 2-year period. You can't even attribute that to it relying on the paddle controller, as other paddle games continued to sell during that time period despite the console no longer coming with the controllers packed in. It may simply be that Demons to Diamonds was something of a flop and not a game in much demand by that point. As for Nick Turner, we've got a lengthy wait until his next published release on the VCS, the licensed game Snoopy and the Red Baron. But Turner was busy in the interim. At the time that Demons to Diamonds was finally reaching store shelves, Turner was putting the finishing touches on Frog Pond, a children's game where frogs go after flies in either a 1- or 2-player game. Frog Pond was promoted fairly heavily by Atari, which showed it off at the 1982 Summer CES, and even provided preview demos to gaming magazines before its cancellation. According to the website Atari Protos, Turner indicated at one point that he wanted to expand this to an 8K cartridge to add more options and gameplay wrinkles, similar to his issues with Demons to Diamonds, but that this was rebuffed. It's possible that this was the catalyst for its cancellation, but it's also entirely plausible that Mattel's Frog Bog for the Intellivision was another. Frog Bog came out in the summer of 1982 and has the same premise as Frog Pond, but frankly plays better, even in its Atari VCS conversion. There has been speculation among game collectors and historians that these similarities were a major reason why Frog Pond was canned, but there's unfortunately very little clarity. Beyond Frog Pond and Snoopy, Turner was tasked with developing opening screen graphics for Atari's Sesame Street licensed games, which debuted not long after Snoopy and the Red Baron. Demons to Diamonds may have suffered from simplicity, but what is there isn't really bad at all. Turner was probably correct to push for more complex options, but even if this package is slight, what's there is pretty interesting if you can get someone to play it with you, particularly if one or both of the players are kids. Our other title of this video is Math Grand Prix. This is an educational game, the likes of which we haven't seen on the VCS since the 1970s with basic math. And I can say very assuredly that it's a much more interesting experience than Gary Palmer's obligatory math release, even though you'd be hard-pressed to get much out of it over a certain age. Math Grand Prix was written by Suki Lee and appears to have been her first game with Atari, though as far as I've been able to find, she has communicated precious little about her time at the company and has not responded to any of my attempts to get in contact. Yet, it is a pretty charming game in its own right, showing off her design chops in a genre that, at this point, hadn't seen too many really interesting attempts at edutainment. On the console front, you really can only point to the math and word fun games on the Intellivision, and while Lee's game doesn't have the mix of game modes seen there, the core package is pretty promising. Targeting kids between the ages of 6 and 10, Math Grand Prix sets players up within a pair of race cars. To advance along the track, the players, or one player in the computer, take turns answering a series of math questions. If you get an answer right, your car moves forward. Guess wrong, and you remain where you are. There's a bit more to it, however. At the start of each turn, the game asks if you want to move 2 or 3 spaces, with 3 space questions being more difficult to solve. You can also bump the other car off the road, wherein it must solve a 2-space question immediately to get back on the road. The computer is particularly aggressive about this, and will try and bump you off any time it gets the chance, and if you're not in one of the safe spots, denoted in the manual as anywhere before the first track crossing and the crossings themselves. There are also multiple track markers along the road, each providing different benefits. The skipper will give you an extra turn, the sinker will protect you from bumps while you're on it, and the spinner will shoot you forward up to 4 spaces. At the end is the steps, where you must answer a 3-step question to reach the finish line. With the base rules out of the way, Math Grand Prix features 9 variations, 3 for addition and subtraction at different levels of difficulty, 3 for multiplication and division at the same spread, and finally 3 combining all 4 types of equations. The difficulty switches adjust whether or not the game gives you a time limit to answer your questions, 1 minute for addition and subtraction, and 2 minutes for multiplication and division. If you fail to answer in the right amount of time, the game gives you the correct answer, but doesn't move you forward. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the cartridge is its dynamic difficulty, dubbed the tutor in the manual. If you get difficult questions correct, the game will give you harder ones to solve, while failing questions will lead it to give you easier ones. It's not quite the same thing as the dynamic computer opponent in Fairchild's Spitfire game, but if the goal is to keep kids playing and not frustrated, I think Lee accomplishes it here. Coming to this as an adult, I admit Math Grand Prix isn't that exciting a game. The math problems are very much geared towards elementary school students, and therefore an adult with a decent sense for math problems will probably have very little trouble, even with the difficulty switches giving you a timer. It could have used better indicators of where each space on the track is exactly, and for solo play, the computer opponent will pretty much always play perfectly and prevent you from just 3-spacing your way to victory, without at least trying to land on at least one of the special markers. In 2-player mode, it's kind of difficult to avoid a situation where you and your opponent are just bumping each other off the road repeatedly after passing the initial crossing, and therefore it's rather difficult to build a solid lead unless your opponent fails to answer a question correctly. But given that this is an educational game, I suppose that's the point. Lee wasn't trying to frustrate kids necessarily, she wanted to give them an entertaining way to do math problems. In this regard, I think Math Grand Prix succeeds in its mission. The track markers are a cool mechanic, and I imagine most kids would get a kick over running their opponent off the road. It could have used some way to randomize or mix up the elements of the racetrack to add a bit of more depth and replayability, as otherwise it doesn't take too much to figure out a strategy to jump through the track fairly easily. I can't really critique this game fairly given my age and experience, but broadly speaking, this is a pretty interesting educational title coming out before the big edutainment boom on the home computers the following year saw some real experimentation on what those kinds of video games could look like. Math Grand Prix saw very few reviews being an educational game that kids were probably not lining up to buy. TV Gamer noted that it is more entertaining than its predecessor, Basic Math, and Joystik called it a good educational game for younger children. Video Game Update also gave it a recommendation for younger kids, though with the caveat that it may be too simplistic for some 10-year-olds. The Logical Gamer crew remarked that the problems may be too simple for kids who have grasped how to use the joystick, though that seems a bit like hyperbole. And while that it may be a good choice for educating children, one could probably get the same effect by spending time going through flashcards with them. We have no sales figures for the first part of its retail life, but internal Atari Corp files from the latter half of the 80s don't paint a picture of Math Grand Prix as a big seller. with the company moving 6 units in 1986 and 932 in 1987. In 1988, however, they sold to retail a surprising 44,719 copies, ending this period of its retail run with a total of 45,657 units. Of the handful of educational games for the VCS, this is the best one not attached to a license, and while the company was still selling its licensed games at that point, it's possible that degree of ingenuity to its design and it being wholly an Atari creation may have had something to do with this extinction burst Math Grand Prix saw in the last good year of VCS sales. Math Grand Prix may have also been the inspiration for Horse Race Math, a Bally Professional arcade basic game written in 1983 by an educator from Ohio named Joe Peoples. He submitted it to the Arcadian newsletter alongside another game he'd written called Dot to Dot, but while the latter game was published, Horse Race Math was not. In a letter to Arcadian publisher Bob Fabris, Peoples said that he'd reworked a November 1980 horse race gambling game written by Howard Bretcheson and published in the Arcadian. Reworked is certainly one way of putting it, as Peoples' version plays much like Math Grand Prix. 1 to 4 players are given math problems to work out and use the knob and joystick to zero in on the correct answer. If you answer right, your horse moves closer to the finish line. While this went unpublished, it was successfully preserved on BallyAlley.com, and makes for a pretty interesting take on the concept using very minimal amounts of memory and code, though losing out on the bumps and the track markers also makes this a simpler affair. It's a fair bet that Peoples may have seen Math Grand Prix and figured that modding an existing horse racing game would be a straightforward way of porting it to the platform, but this is purely speculation. It's also plausibly just a case of convergent software evolution, given that Peoples, who passed away in 2009, was primarily a junior high school math teacher until his retirement in 1985. Following Math Grand Prix, Lee's path turned towards working on licensed games. She's credited for the 1983 release Obelix, sold primarily in Europe and Canada as Asterix is a fairly obscure property in the US, and Donald Duck's Speedboat, unreleased by Atari but seemingly licensed to Brazilian company Polyvox and sold there. While both games are incredibly obscure in the US, they reflect a sense of graphical fidelity and a sense of humor in line with the source material. She may not have been a prolific game developer, but Lee has chops, and even something as unassuming as Math Grand Prix showcases her skills. For adults, this may be little more than a rarely played filler cartridge for a collection, but the ideas here are sound, even if it could have used a little more randomization. Next time, we're patrolling day and night for new game publishers.